Providence in the year 1762, a hearth is opened in the Rutherford townhouse, and a shallow chamber is found behind brick and pitch, a child's bell chained to stone, 2 tiny chairs bolted to the floor, a nursery ledger half burned and scored with pairs of tally marks. Stay with me. Subscribe if you dare to uncover more forgotten tragedies. The remaining words in the ledger read: provided for the twins this night, then a smear of ink and ash as if a hand reconsidered what truth should live. We were never meant to see this, never meant to speak their names, never meant to touch the bell that no longer rings. But why did this happen? And why was it erased from history? There is a house on the rise above the river, brick and restraint on the outside, winter air in its mouth. The year is 1762. Providence carries the taste of salt and soot, and the Rutherford name moves through parlors like a ship through fog. Everything looks proper from the street. Inside, under the hearthstone, something that should never have been found waits as if listening for us. Listen. The mason prees loose a brick that is newer than its neighbors. Pitch clings in black veins to the edges. The mortar breaks with a sound that is not a sound, more like a breath returning to a room that was robbed of it. Behind the panel there is no soot, darkened crawl space the length of a child. Instead a shallow chamber set tight to the foundation, the air trapped and stale, the stones sweating even in the cold. A chain kisses the floor, welded into the base, and at its far end hangs a bell meant for a hand that never grew large enough to lift it easily. The bell is choked with dust. It does not ring when the chain is moved. It shivers only, and then grows still. 2 chairs wait in that narrow mouth of darkness, chairs small enough that they seem toys until you see the iron bolts that hold their legs to the flagstone. The bolts are wide-headed and beat flat, as if someone did not want the wrench to find a purchase later. The wood is smoothed by use, the backs rubbed shiny where shoulders moved again and again. No scratches on the floor from being dragged. They never moved. They were not meant to be moved. On the ledge behind the bell lies the book. Not a Bible, though it pretends to be with its cracked leather and the ghost of a gilt edge. It is a nursery ledger, too carefully made, too carefully hidden. Half its leaves are burned, not consumed, only sinned and blistered and stuck together, as if a fire was started in doubt and pinched out by a shaking hand. The front board is cut by a knife that stopped just short of the paper. On the flyleaf, a name once written with pride has been scraped thin as a bird's eggshell. You can see the indent though the ink is gone. We were never meant to find this. We were meant to sit upstairs in the parlor, admire the paneling, note the respectable portraits, sip whatever is offered and praise the view. We were meant to believe the house had no cellar at all beyond a place to keep preserves. We were meant to stand in a guided line and drift out into daylight with our faces untroubled. We were meant to leave the children out of it. The ledger falls open where heat lifted the paste. Opposite the brown gap a page remains, bubbled and stiff and saved by accident. The ink is brown as a healed wound. The hand is neat and narrow, with a small final flourish at the end of each entry. It says, provided for the twins this night. Then a line of ink breaks in a smear like a tide pulled across it by a thumb. It is not a sentence after that. It is a refusal to continue. You can see where the pen tried to find its footing again and failed. You can see where ash fell and settled into the wet. We were not meant to speak their names. We were meant to lose them between the lines, where polite families lose what cannot be told. Stay with me. Stand at the hearth with your hand on the brick. Hear the bell that will not ring. The chain is cold. The chain remembers the habit of small hands. There is a mark in the dust where a wrist must have rubbed, again and again, where the skin-polished iron in a narrow arc smaller than a grown hand could make. If you feel the faint sickness in your stomach, if your throat has gone dry, it is because this was not written for daylight. It was not written even for candlelight. It was written to be entombed in the colder paper of silence. Stay with me and I will read it to you. Stay with me and let the dust settle on our tongues as it did on theirs. Stay with me. Subscribe if you dare to uncover more forgotten tragedies, and I will keep opening the brickwork that others plastered shut. The ledger is a plain thing, No flourishes inside, only what was done and what must not be told. The entries run in pairs, 2 tallies for each day, 2 small cups counted, 2 crumbs recorded, 2 hushes noted as if hush were a ration like bread. The lines begin with untroubled words. Milk delivered, by night, break thin, straw replaced, doctor spoke. Then at some point the nouns begin to stagger. Curtains drawn. Windows smeared. Shutters nailed. The script remains calm while the meaning darkens like an evening that never becomes night, because the shutters are already there. One line repeats itself, so often the hand seems to fall into it like a chant. For their good, for their good, for their good. Every refusal in this ledger is written as a mercy. That is what I cannot forgive. Hold the flame close. The right margin carries faint imprints where some leaf was torn out a long time ago. Names once lived there. Names have weight and heat, and you can feel where they went. There is evidence pressed into the paper where 2 sets of letters were begun, one with a curl like a river, one with a sharp upstroke. There is a blotted place where the pen stopped, as if the hand that wrote could not bear the second half of a second name and crushed it under the nib before anyone else could read. We are told not to ask why the ledger was hidden. We are told houses have quirks, that families keep strange things for strange reasons, that old bricks do not give answers, that old iron does not explain itself. But I have seen enough rooms such as this to know a pattern when it breathes under my fingers. The bell was not a toy. The chairs were not play. The chain was not for a nursery game. The ledger was not a list of kindnesses. The careful hand tried to make it so, but the ash betrayed the intent. There is a certain sound the room makes when the last brick is levered out, the sound of a hollow place sighing. The air that comes out of such a place is old, long held. It tastes of pitch and iron, and something else that is not entirely of the house. The mason crossed himself without thinking, and then looked away from his own hand, as though it had tricked him. He said only that the wall had been double built, brick laid against brick without reason, and the space between made neat, as if someone measured a very small distance with great care. If you lean into that space, if you let your ear rest against the threshold, you will hear nothing. But your bones will know that nothing is a shape. A space saves the outline of what it held. That is the first cruelty. A room remembers. It holds the curve of shoulders, the pattern of steps, the tired clockwork of breath. A room is a negative photograph of its occupants. Light where they were dark, dark where they were light. This chamber was made to keep such silhouettes hidden forever. Even the suit has nothing to cling to. Even the spiders kept their distance. There is writing underneath the writing. Turn the page and tilt it in the light. See the wrong side of the ink, the bleed through that makes a shadow of the words on the page below. I have held this book by its ruined spine and read it backward by its own haunting. It keeps saying the same thing, provided for the twins this night. The ink is not all the same color when it repeats that line. Sometimes it is darker, freshly mixed and impatient. Sometimes pale, as though water was added to stretch it, and the nib dragged dry. Once the hand quivers, as though someone spoke while it was writing, and the pen hung, still, blotting. There are thumbprints where a writer hovered too long over what they were doing. I will not tell their names yet. If I speak them too soon, the house will close its mouth again, and we will be left with a neat facade and a tour guide's laugh. We are not tourists here. We are not safe. We are standing at the hearth in our stocking feet, heat at our shins, winter at the back of our necks. The ash rises in slow motes even without being touched. My voice stays low because the room seems to require that. There is no law written that makes lower voices necessary in the presence of certain truths. But you and I both know we obey it as if it were carved on stone. If you wish to leave now, do it. No one will think the worse of you. There is a door behind you that remembers how often people chose it over the deeper door we are about to open. But if you are the sort who wishes the lantern turned down rather than up, if you prefer to read what was excised rather than what was printed, then step closer. Touch the chain. Watch your fingertips come away with a gray mark that is not quite dust. It will not leave your skin easily. You will look for a cloth, that is not there and rub at your fingers with your own shirt. There is a rumor that the bell used to ring by itself. There is a rumor that the bell never worked at all. Two contrary truths lie side by side on the same page, and the paper does not tear. That is how families live with what they have done. The ledger tried to be both at once. It tried to be a prayer and a defense and a receipt. It tried to make an account that could satisfy God, the law, the neighbors, the self. It failed all of them, and that failure is the only honest thing about it. The next leaf is fused to a fragment of another. The glue gave up, but the heat married them. I eased them apart as gently as I could. The ink scratched a pattern even where the words have vanished. The scratches spell out an itinerary of darkness. Before bedtime, nail and pitch. After prayer, bread and water. After bread, silence. After silence, check the chord. After the chord, pray again. At the bottom of one page, in a hand different from the others, smaller, more hurried, there is a sentence that looks like a protest, that knows it will be interrupted. They are not bad, only bright. The page tears there. The ink bleeds into the torn edge, as if it were trying to cross into the next piece of paper, and could not find a bridge. I held that torn edge in the light a long time. I waited for the word after bright to appear. It did not. Who were they to write that? Who were they to decide that bright required darkness? Ask yourself what kind of house writes rules for a bell on a child's wrist. Ask yourself what kind of love requires bolts in the floor. Ask yourself how many hands must be involved to make a room that is this small, this clean, this hidden. Ask yourself how many of those hands shook. I am told to be careful with names. I am told that once a full name is spoken into a chamber like this, it is a summons. Perhaps that is ceremony only. Perhaps it is only courtesy to the dead. Perhaps it is only superstition that helps us keep our places. I honor it anyway. I keep my voice on the side of caution. I keep my sentence short when the silence presses back. I do not tell you what was in the crate under the hearthstones when the fire was first laid that winter. I tell you only that this ledger repeats the line about provision again, so many times the phrase itself goes hollow. You might say this is only a record of quarantine, that the page does not show intention, that restraint bears many meanings, that preservation can look like punishment in the dim light of retrospect. You might say I am reading into the ash a story that suits my fear. To you I say lift the chairs. Try and feel how firmly they resist. Tell me who bolts a child's chair to stone so that it does not skitter. Tell me who chisels an extra wall behind the hearth and lines it with pitch so that sound will slide down it and go no further. Tell me who hides the record where only a fire will find it and then does not let the fire finish its work. You hear the little ringing in your own head already. That it is a phantom does not make it less. The bell hangs light. A breath might stir it. It is a bell that exists more in the idea of it than in the hearing. A bell of helplessness. A bell of summons. The bell that called downstairs for someone to open a door and unbolt a chair. The bell that called upstairs for a conscience to become a hand on a key. The bell that was tied to a wrist, so that a small person could pull a small sound into a day where they were otherwise useless. The bell that was cut when the sound grew too steady to bear. I can show you the slice in the rope where a blade chewed it. I can show you the line on the ledger where someone drew a line instead of writing a word. I can show you the suit between bricks that touched air only once when the hiding was being done. It flakes like old thoughts. It marks the fingers it touches. It will mark you as it has marked me. We share it now. That is how such histories pass to a new carrier. Through dust. Through a page no one should have read. Through a story that people swallowed rather than speak. Through a bell that refuses to ring for anyone, but the mind that hears it anyway. If you can feel that chain in your palm as you listen, if you can imagine the cold iron wake your skin because the house remembers holding its shape, then you are fit to come down with me into the rest of it. Do not leave yet. I promise no spectacle. I promise only what the papers did not print, and what the neighbors learned to say carefully, and what the ledger confessed when it slipped from its own hand. There is a sentence written at the very back in a place where most people never look. The page is nearly blank. The corner is folded, notched as if someone meant to return to it, then forgot or could not bear to. The ink is faint and the hand is someone else's again. It says they must be kept as one. Nothing follows. Nothing needs to. You already see the pairs everywhere, the twos of everything, the double place set at a table, and cleared before dawn, the double shoes never seen outdoors, the double shadows that crossed the nursery door, the double tallies pressed into paper by a hand that never believed in any God but necessity. You feel it in your own body, the way a twin thought looks like a single thought carried twice through a room. That is how this house holds them, not as persons with names but as a condition, a complication, a problem that must be solved. It did not solve them. It erased them, then wrote them back, then hid the writing and hoped time would eat the rest. I am not a priest of any firm order. I am a keeper of frayed edges and burned spines and brittle glue. I am not paid to forgive anyone. I am not paid at all. I am led by the smell of old ink and the scratch of quills that still ring under the touch if you lay your ear to them. I am led by rooms that hum when no one is singing. I am led by houses that pretend at innocence and cannot hold it. I am led by their own hand in their own book, saying the line I cannot stop hearing. Provided for the twins this night. If you are wondering whether the brick gave up easily to let us see this, it did not. It made us earn each inch. It made us learn the shape of the trowel that set it. It made us count along with the ledger, one brick twice over, one cavity doubled, one death multiplied. Do not correct me on that last word. Do not call it by some lighter term. I have hands black with pitch to answer such softening. There are sins as old as the first walls. The mortar knows their names if you force it. You want to know who ordered the work, who paid, who pretended to believe the story the house told, who signed the bottom of the page. You want to know if there is a grave with a pretty stone. You want to know if anyone was ever punished for this. I promise to follow those questions into the narrowest print I can find. I promise to bring you every fragment of diary, and every stray page of the Gazette, and every whispered letter at the back of every cupboard. But first I must teach you how to stand in this room and not become someone who looks away. That is the lesson hidden under the brick. That is the test of this house. So, stay. Subscribe if you dare to keep walking with me along these narrow stairways and through these asleep corridors. Speak softly in the comments if you have seen a bell like this elsewhere, if your town keeps a story behind stucco and painted shutters. I read every theory, and I am not alone. Houses listen. Families listen. Names that were rubbed thin listen. We were not meant to open this chamber. We were not meant to touch this book. We were not meant to feel the iron sing against our skin. Yet here we are, hands blackened, voices low, faces turned toward a gap in brick that used to be nothing, and now is everything. We were not meant to know there were 2 chairs and 2 tallies and 2 cups and 2 nightgowns, folded on a shelf no bigger than a breath. We were not meant to know that someone wrote the same line night after night, as if repetition could soften what they were doing. We were not meant to know that at some point the pen stopped and the ash fell. But why did this happen, and why was it erased from history? You cannot begin with the hidden room. You must first let Providence arrange its respectable face. Year 1762. Tied in the river a patient machine, tall masts nodding above the wharves, the town rising on its 2 banks like cupped hands around a bowl of salt, smoke threading from brick chimneys and carrying the smell of molasses, fish, tallow. The crown still sits on everything like a polished weight. The talk is business and God and weather, in that order, unless fever knocks, and then the order reverses itself. Down at the landing. Hogsheads marked with raw initials. Men at the winch calling in measured voices that are not cruel, because there is no time for cruelty when a barrel must not split. Sloops and brigs shouldering the tide. Lists in chalk on warehouse doors. Rum out, molasses in, nails, sailcloth, dried peas, Bermuda onions, sugar that clumps like wet sand indigo, coffee, salt fish. The words become a catechism for anyone who stands long enough by the water. They remind the town who it is. Up the slope from the wharf. Back street runs along the hill in a plain line. Later it will be benefit. For now it is only a thoroughfare with aspirations. Carpentered facades offer their best manners to the street. Brick is a sign that a family believes in itself. Paint is kept fresh because paint reads as virtue in a town that admires thrift, but also notices shine. Windows are washed. Brass knockers are polished until the reflection comes out like a friend who has not been seen in a while. Steps are scrubbed. Linens hang indoors to be spared the coal dust the wind carries from the water. The Providence Gazette begins that autumn as if the town were clearing its throat. Thin sheets, notices for auctions and ships cleared for sea, runaway apprentices, sometimes with the phrase likely to pass for a sailor. A small advertisement for a surgeon who bleeds, extracts, and performs inoculation at moderate cost. Line by line the paper suggests a public life that wants to behave. Names of committees, names of subscribers, names of the dead sandwiched between sales and sermons. Each week folds over the last. Each week forgets what should not be recalled. The Gazette is an honorable curtain. The less respectable scenes stand just behind it, hands motionless. Meeting houses mark the hill. A congregation that calls itself Baptist by habit, if not always by doctrine. A congregation for the King's Church. A Quaker house that objects to nearly everything but never loudly. Bells shape the day. The bells are an honest sound. They claim the Sabbath. They claim funerals. Sometimes they claim money for the poor. The sound crawls through streets at the same hour that a small bell somewhere else in town learns a different duty. You hear both if you are listening in the right doorway. In the town council books that year the ink keeps its own counsel. A vote that the highways be mended after flood. An allowance for the widow who keeps a lame boarder out of the street. A complaint about the quality of the fish in market. A note that the poorhouse requires new bedding, and that a new fence be set around the north burial ground to keep swine from rooting among the graves. The language is flat, tidy, and unafraid. No one writes their secrets into such a book, yet the margins sometimes carry a faint private hand. A clerk who writes an extra word and scratches it, a name started and halted. A habit of erasure that tells on the town more than it intends. Providence loves a ledger. Merchants keep them as if God has subcontracted salvation to anyone who can add a column without error. The Rutherfords keep theirs without smudge. Their counting house near the river smells like paper and oil, and that cool breath that rises from water even in summer. They are exact with numbers. They sign their names with the same even stroke on a sugar invoice that they use on a subscription list for poor relief. They give to the meeting house or to the church, depending on which visitor rings first. They lend quietly. They collect less quietly. They host a supper now and then. A family that feels made and settled. They live in a brick house on the rise, red against the gray of the common weather. Window lights divided small to keep their strength. A fanlight above the door. A hushed refinement indoors, not ostentatious, a rehearsed modesty. Chairs with splats like tulips. Maple polished until it looks like still water. A hearth that draws well. The kind of inventory that would please a cousin writing from Boston. The kind of house the Gazette would mention by implication rather than by name. Respectability needs no parade. The family Bible sits in the parlor, covered when the weather threatens. It has seen baptisms and swaddled grief. It has a place reserved for the names to be entered with a sober hand and no fuss. Later someone will claim they saw 2 faint divots where ink once pressed through and was scraped away. Do not leap ahead. For now the Bible simply exists as a piece of furniture that promises to keep its pages safe. There is a doctor who makes his way between such houses, by day and by night, his bag never fully unpacked. He writes in a notebook with boiled-down formulae and a moralizing tone that he cannot help. He believes that shade and quiet can cure more than they do. He approves of curtains drawn in the heat. He disapproves of his own doubts. He visits when called. He does not always ask the right questions. He tells himself he has no warrant to ask anything else. In the Gazette, a small paragraph praises his skill in managing a fever on the west side. It does not mention that he missed something larger on the hill. A rumor of a new college moves through town. Men in wigs argue over whether it will rise here or elsewhere. Merchants claim that learning improves commerce if not the soul. Dissenters claim that learning requires freedom to roam. Hands are shaken in taverns. Letters are posted to men of influence. Meanwhile, children are born in rooms where voices keep low because they must, and in other rooms because they enjoy the sound of a whisper in a plump bed. The rhythm of births and deaths goes on, always ahead of institutions that claim to govern them. Providence is a place where a child can vanish without anyone agreeing on where they went. The river decides some questions. Winter decides others. Families decide the rest behind shutters. The poor who become mad are sometimes lodged with a citizen for a small allowance, at least on paper. Workhouse for those who can be set to a task. The rest stay inside wherever they were born. The words lunatic and distraction and visitation of God sit on pages like coarse salt. You taste them even if you do not want to. An account for a child kept within a house would never be written so bluntly. It would call itself prudence. It would call itself a kindness. The Rutherfords keep servants, not many, just enough to keep the floors shining and the kitchen operating like a ship. They take apprentices in the way of the town. A boy brings his small bundle at dawn and sleeps under the slope of the roof and learns to count or to plane or to copy figures. He leaves his childhood name at home and lets the house give him a new one that fits better inside its walls. A girl comes to learn the discipline of sleeves and hearths and silence. These lives cut across the family life without merging. They notice what owners do not notice. Owners notice what they wish to see. That is how the upstairs survives. An old culvert runs down toward the river, half forgotten. It was a ditch when the town was newer, and became something more formal when the brickmakers prospered. The mason remembers when the wall at the hearth was thickened for better draught. No reason to speak of it when the work is ordinary. The joiner can be silent for a price that looks small if paid in silver, and large if paid in memory. On a street where houses are always being improved, another hammer bothers no one. This is a town that builds all day, while the press prints and the bells teach patience. The north burial ground lies just beyond the more immediate houses, a breath away from the lives that pretend they will not need it for a long time. The fence goes up this year, weak in places, repaired twice before winter. The stones tilt because Providence ground is a restless sleeper. Names efface themselves. Most is a slow good work that no man plans. 2 small tablets could easily be lost among larger granite and marble. No particular sorrow need attach to that. Time erases names that were never meant to be spoken widely in the first place. The silence of the ground is efficient. A letter survives in a desk that was resold twice and then donated to a church rummage in the 19th century. The letter is earlier than that sale by 100 and more years. A woman writes to a cousin in Attleborough that the town has taken to inoculation, and that some say it is a bargain with terror and others that it is deliverance. She writes that a family of position has failed to show their twins in the meeting house since midsummer, and that no one asks because people prefer to be ignorant rather than impolite. She adds a flourish of blessing across the bottom of the page and does not mention the house again. The letter has survived only because it was tucked under a false bottom. This is how history hides its sharper edges under the dull ones. A black line appears in a ledger that should not have anything to do with anything living. Purchase of pitch, purchase of nails, brick accounted. 2 chairs paid to a craftsman who usually makes toys. It means nothing on its own. It is a household stiffening itself for winter. Wood laid in, the kitchen plastered anew, the nursery paint repaired. Across town, another ledger shows purchases of shrouds, and a baker notes that he provided more loaves than usual for a wake that did not happen in public. In Providence, respect often requires the absence of a crowd. We must set the social air of 1762 with fairness. People keep to the Sabbath because the year has not yet loosened its grip on the idea that a holy day can shape a week. They keep to the habit of neighbors, of mutual aid, of small conspiracies that consist of asking no questions when a family draws its shutters before noon. The law tries to be a gentleman. It keeps its boots out of parlors unless there is a brawl. It finds men who swear in public. It neglects the indoors. The indoors is a country with its own rulers, often a mother, sometimes a father, more often the weight of an idea that no one can name. We must speak of money, because it oiling the hinge of this door. Providence rises on trade that is clean on one face, and far from clean on the other. Households own people without always owning the shame of it. The Gazette prints notices that turn human beings into property with a price attached. The same page praises a sermon on charity. That is the respectable surface. Two sentiments nested without discomfort. The Rutherfords move in this world with grace. They attend to charity when asked. They are no different from their neighbors in that they understand which stories make them look good. A maid survives in the record as initials in a vestry book. She is dismissed for impertinence, which can mean anything in a house that does not want to name its discomfort. She goes to her sister in Pawtuxet. She says nothing in public. She tells a neighbor in market that the nursery is kept too dim for her taste, and that she hears a small bell at noon occasionally, and at midnight more often. The neighbor tells a friend. The friend tells no one. A rumor is not a document. A rumor carries only as far as the ear that needs it. For years nothing else is found in writing. Town plans do not show small rooms inside hearths. They show squares and lines and the river in its place, and the pasture in its place, and the poor house set out of the way. The draft of the street which will one day be benefit runs firm on paper. Houses look like blocks in an orderly child's arrangement. The architect who drew the map did not know he was making a veil. His ink does a good job of pretending that everything is known. The map does not feel the grit of pitch under a mason's thumb. When I say respectable surface, I mean the habit of moving through rooms with eyes open only to certain details. A pew rented near the front. A donation list with a generous sum for a school. A resolve to fund a winter coal distribution. A subscription to the library company. A set of silver marked with an initial on the bottom, never displayed. The public posture of Providence is modesty with expenditure hidden under it like a spring under a carpet. No one trips if they know where to step. The Rutherfords step well, and yet. The ledger that lists charity also lists silence as a purchase. The pew does not record absences. The Gazette prints what suits it. The doctor's notebook trails off when the case becomes inconvenient. The servant story does not meet paper until a clerk, with a soft heart, crosses himself and tucks a line into a church book where no one looks. The respectable surface is what keeps the door from swinging open too quickly. It is also what builds the latch that can hold it shut for years. This town records itself in fragments. A mariner's journal with 2 pages torn out and a smear of tallow on the cover. A midwife's list of fees with a note that one newborn came doubled and took poorly to the light. A mason's bill for work done in haste near Back Street on a day that followed a night of rain. A child's slate found near a foundation wall with practiced letters that mirror one another cleverly. I do not need to tell you which house stands above that wall. The evidence clings even when the paper pretends not to see it. Do not think the neighbors were wicked. They were ordinary. Ordinary can be lethal when mixed with fear. Some believed in fevers that travel like smoke and can be kept out by shutters. Some believed that children born as a pair bear twice the hazard. Some believed in bad air and too much light. Some believed that a parent has a right to make a plan for the safety of the house and the saving of its name. Respectability is the laundered word that hides fear. You can smell fear even under lie. Stand outside the Rutherford house with me for a moment in late November. A cart passes with green wood that will not burn well this year. A man in a blue coat taps twice on a door across the street and waits to be let in because the latch is stubborn. A woman carries a basket with 2 loaves and covers them with a fold of cloth in a particular careful way. The east windows of the Rutherford nursery carry pitch in their seams that you would not see unless the afternoon light catches it. A shutter holds a nail that was set once and pulled. The mark is almost invisible. Almost. The books of the church show the family paid for a pew near the front, as expected. It does not show baptisms for 2 born in 1759, though there is evidence in a private note that a minister came to the house by special request after dusk. Another note says the mother was ailing. Another says she took the air alone when she could. None of this would have been remarked upon if the matter had ended simply. It did not end simply. I bring you this context so that when we turn to the event itself, you will not imagine it sprang from a grotesque curiosity of one household alone. It rises from the habits of the town, its love of order, its fear of illness, its hunger for a clean appearance, its willingness to write only what will not trouble the morning. The hidden room is the logical end of such a town, when pushed by a secret that refuses to shrink. Do you see how the surface shines? Do you see how many hands work to keep it polished? Then you know how heavy the hand must be that writes a line and stops halfway. You know how much strain it takes to erase a name from a family Bible and smooth the paper, until the scar looks almost like the grain. You understand that a chain is not an accident. Neither is a bell that forgets how to ring. The neighbors say it began with the east windows. Pitch worked into the seams by a hand that did not trust wood alone. Nails set and pulled and set again until the grain frayed and the paint remembered. A curtain that never moved even in wind. At noon a small bell that sounded thinneth breath against glass. At midnight the same bell answering itself as if time had a mirror. The mother walked with her eyes cast down and her hands in the posture of prayer. Even when no one spoke to her, the father kept the street well and nodded with a practiced gravity that suggested grief had been accepted and filed. In the Providence Gazette, for the last week of November, a line printed smaller than the rest. 2 children of a gentleman of standing taken with putrid fever and laid without public observation at the North Burial Ground. No names, no hour, no minister named. The sheet kept its tone. The small notice sat between an advertisement for sailcloth and a complaint about counterfeit Spanish coin. The paper was behaving as a paper should. It offered an account that traveled easily from doorstep to study. A dismissed maid's deposition, thin as a reed and written in a vestry book at the back, where no one would look unless they were cleaning wax from the leather, tells another room. She speaks of a pallet of straw and salt kept fresh, as if someone believed that dryness could save a soul. She writes of a lamp removed after sundown to improve obedience. She writes of the twins speaking in mirror phrases in the dark, a call that was always answered, a counting that seemed to mean more in the room than it would to anyone outside. She writes that the bell could be heard when the house was quiet, and that the bell was not tied to a door pull. A river carter gave his statement in a different season and to a different ear. He is recorded by a clerk who did not mean to keep the sheet at all. He says that a coach without a lantern came twice by night. He says that a crate was lowered into the culvert that runs from the hill to the tide. He says that the men who did it moved with quiet hands, as if they feared something other than waking a household. He says that the next day the flagstones were sluiced with lye, and the air of the house carried a clean that did not smell like winter. The carter is exact on the weight of the crate. He is exact on the hour. He is less exact on who stood in the shadow of the doorway watching. There is a fragment of a private ledger now scarred by ash. It tallies the month with care. Break, milk, doctor, then a sudden run of entries that do not suit the surface of a nursery. Pitch paid, nails in quantity, a joiner for a false case, a mason for work described only as quick and discreet. An entry for 2 small chairs with their legs made firm by the craftsman who sometimes carved toys. A final payment made to a man whose name is not normally in such books. The amount is generous. The note beside it says simply for silence. What do you think? Leave your thoughts below. I read every theory. A physician's notebook for that season survives, with pressed leaves inside that have turned white from the long press of paper. He writes of twinship as a curious symmetry. He writes of pulses that keep time in 2 wrists, as if they belong to a shared heart. He warns of light-harming eyes that were opened too early in the womb or too late in a room kept shut to manage fever. He notes a bell cut in haste because the sound nagged at the marrow. He believes the cure is shade and food. He writes shade so often that the word becomes a charm. He warns the mother to keep them from sun. He calls them little clocks when they sleep. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. A boy who brings milk to the kitchen door hears a set of numbers floated through cracks at midday. One voice says 1 and the other answers 1 again. They proceed together to 7, then begin again as if numbers were a ladder too short to reach the window. He sees a shadow behind a curtain where there should be only a wall. He tells no one because boys do not have a right to witness anything in a house like this. Something happened years later in settlement of Pine Ridge. Only years later he tells a wife at dinner who writes it in the margin of a family recipe for molasses cakes. A minister writes from the hill in a notebook that becomes his life's last. He writes that a family of prominence is under affliction and has chosen Christian resignation over display. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. He writes that there are occasions which must not be brought to the meeting house because the meeting house is not yet large enough to hold the weight of them. He writes that the sea teaches us to contain storms within our own hull. He never says twins, he never says cellar, he never says chain. He closes with a prayer for patience. He would say later that he did not know, that it does not confirm that claim. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. Now to the night everyone pretends not to recall. Rain came up from the river and struck the street sideways. The bell in the meeting house tower bumped its own tongue and made a sound like a mistake. In the Rutherford house a lamp was carried down and not lit. A key was taken from a cup that had behind a door. The hearth wall moved with the unhappy Sonderwood remembering when it was a tree. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pines. Either the narrow chamber breathed the way a bird breathes when a hawk passes over. Brett Hodder followed. The candle stayed outside. The bell moved on its chain without sound as if warning a future. Rather happened next. Levs in one telling like this. The father went down because he had been told by the physician to examine their eyes for signs of light. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge and the father could not bear the bell. He gripped the rope and sawed it with a knife that was meant for apples. The bell fell against the stone and made an honest ring. One last time he panicked. He pushed the bell under the pallet. The twins followed the sound with their heads as if hearing rain in the foundation. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. He rose too fast and struck his head on the low frame and swore into his own cupped hand to keep the word from reaching anyone else. He climbed up with his lamp and shut the door. The rain made the same sound on the windows as ash makes on paper. Another telling says something harder. The mother came down alone. She knelt and held the chain as if it were a rosary, and she did not have permission to own one. Something happened in the small settlement of Pine Ridge. She whispered for a long time. The entry for that night never provided for the twins, and then the ink turns to tide and spreads and refuses to write again. The crate was fetched before dawn. Hiller to the work and did not look into the open heart of the hill because whatever stared back would have been their last courage. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Ridge. When the crate slid into the dark, the water changed its sound as if it had swallowed a new vowel it was not built to pronounce. A sailor swore later that he saw a small box float under the bridge 3 days after the worst. The rain then it moved like a thing steering itself. A washerwoman told a friend that something like a bell rang out by the river at noon for a week and then stopped. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. The sexton at the burial ground maintains that 2 small plots were marked in the ground with stones at their corners, but that when the new fence went up, the markers disappeared. The sexton drinks and sees pears where there are none. He may be right. He may be telling a story that keeps him from hearing some other sound in his sleep. Inside the house kitchen was scrubbed twice over in one day. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. The smell of lye climbed the stairs and hung, and there was not needed. The shutters on the east window were open for an hour at last and then closed again with a new nail. A carpenter visited before nightfall. The hearth was mended according to a plan on a scrap that we do not possess. A false case of books arrived with a wagon that had no mark. It was carried up the front steps like a gift. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. All of this happened within a week. The Gazette printed a sermon on contentment. The town took the sermon into its pocket and felt better as long as it stayed there. One witness who will not be named wrote that the twins were seen at the nursery window the week before all this and that their eyes failed to blink in the manner of children. They stared as if they were reading a text written in the air. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pines. When a cloud moved over the sun, they turned their heads together. When a stray cat passed in the yard, they did what it says. They were not ill in the way of fever. They were given to another kind of weather. The witness put the sheet away and did again. It is told in kitchen gossip that the children had learned to speak to one another in a tongue that made the nurse teeth ache. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Ridge, that it was not foreign but rather a domestic speech, doubled and bent back on as sat well in the ear of an adult, that they trained a spider to carry thread between the chairs, that they invented a game in which one would breathe while the other held breath and then they would trade on account, that the bell became a metronome rather than a summons. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. These are the kinds of tales that grow when a house smothers its own story. They are not less true for being strange. They are not more true either. If this were only fever, the town would have had a parade of sorrow and been done with it. If this were only scan, the town have enjoyed it and then pretended it had never eaten. What we have is a ledger that refuses to finish his sentence. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement. Rope that bears the mark of a knife, a crate-shaped rumor that cannot be set gently down. The doctor who wrote shade until the word began to look like a face. A minister who blessed a silence he did not understand. A father who spoke at his counting house in numbers and did not permit himself to count backward. A mother who learned to move without making dust rise. I have a brick that was laid to cover the small door. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement than the others, and smoother and tasted of pitch. When the dust wet the tongue, the mason left a stroke on it where the trowel slipped. The stroke looks like a careless mark until you match it to the stroke on his bill, the same impatient curve in the S of his name. He did the work in a day and did not write what the work was on the line. He wrote quick, he wrote discreet. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement at home. Even if you repeat not want the rhyme, he really knows it anyway. This is how the nineteen that feels most true to the house the bell is cut. The ledger shuts itself when the candle pulls away. Upstairs a plate is set and then removed. Outside the rain finishes explaining to the street who's in charge. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. Down at the river a watcher who is not paid to watch sees nothing because seeing would cost too much. In the morning the meeting no one hears the other bell. The rope lies on the floor like a nerve. Speak your thought into this doorway if you dare. Write what you believe the culvert carried. Name what you think the ledger meant when it refused to go on. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement. I will carry your theory down the stair with me and lay it where the dust still holds the shape of 2 small hands. The papers called it negligence, but locals whispered of something darker. The neat line in Gazette wants you to rest your head on the word fever and sleep. The ledger under the hearth refuses your rest. Between those 2 voices the town learned to live. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge, and to choose whichever sentence best matched the hour and the company, one gentle account persisted for years. Quarantine. It says the Rutherfords were prudent and airs crept in through every unguarded seam. It points to the doctor's notebook where shade is prescribed like a sacrament, where eyes are said to be overwide to light, where the twins are called little clocks with hands that tick in time. Something happened in the small presbytery to have pine reed. It softens the chain cord. It softens a cord to a bell rope. It claims the chairs were fixed only to keep delirium from sending small body into the fire. It calls the ledger a mother's account of care, bread thin but clean, water. A prayer counted as oration, for their good written until the phrase gets a pill. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge, but not everyone agreed on what really happened. Against that mercy stands a list of work that does not fit a sick room. Pitch a joiner who built concealment rather than comfort, the mason who wrote quick and discreet and did not say what an entry that pays a man for silence as if silence were a commodity like sugar, the cold roke at night to accept a crate. Something happened the small Presby Pine Ridge, if the bookcase carried in as a house were ashamed and wishful in the same breath, the smell of lion halls where no laundry hung. If this was only caution, it looks like forced into architecture. If this was only mercy, it had a strange love of brick. Another telling reaches for explain the cruelty smuggling. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. Providence eats by trade, and some of that trade goes by unlicensed channels, even while pews are paid and psalms are sung. The culvert from the tide to becomes a brain with too many numbers to keep. A coach without lantern twice before dawn. The twins take a noon midnight and learn the hour by a bell and by footsteps under the boards. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. A child who hears nightly lists of weights and tides begins to repeat them. Child who hears the word sugar at the wrong time learns something about men with badges. The house chooses darkness over a visit from the crowns. Becomes a habit. Habit becomes a room. The children become the price of the room. Then the chairs were in the story. Contraband does not require a bolt in a child's care. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Bad does not require mirror counting in the dark. The ledger's repetition mercy is ill-suited to a tale of tariffs. A criminal defense would have burned the book entirely. It would not have torn a sentence, and a match-protecting barrel speaks differently than a mother nursing her fears that only convince her half the time. The oldest one negate the story its oldest bones. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. A doubling curse, they said. Twins in that bloodline before, mirrors shrouded in linen, portraits turned to face them wandering, preds tied in pairs under a bed to keep urns multiplied until the minister suspected idolatry. They say a minister with too much night and not enough scripture came after dark by a side gate. He carried book. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement that had bought a small bottle that smelled like hedge and iron. He taught a practice called a shadow fad. No candle, no window, no reflective surface allowed to know a face. Bell tied for summons alone. The phrase they must be kept as one written once in the back of the ledgers is offered as proof when memory grows tired. The bolt becomes a charm. The brick door becomes a ward. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. In for the twins this night becomes an incantation. Someone spoke until the words forgot they were words. But the congregation did not such bear such rights. The town that tolerated many doctrines did not tolerate. The midnight ones would have called it cruelty. The Baptists would have called it pride masquerading as mystery. The doctor would have called it fully dressed in piety. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. No one ever found a scrap of real ritual when the brick came away. No chalk marking, no black thread knotted in numbers, only iron and ash and a sentence afraid to finish itself. If a charm lived there, lived only a mind that needed it. A humble theory wears a white coat and keeps the daylight. It says the twins suffered a real affliction of the nerve photophobia fits. Something happened in the small Presbytery of the blood at the tender at the temples that made light a knife. The cure in 1762 looks like darkness and quiet. Chairs fixed to a convulsion does not throw a body against it so that a hand can ask without standing. A rope cut because an honest sound became unbearable to a father who already doubted his kindness. Shade written so often in the physician's book that Warren turns as a vowel and turns to a hum. Something happened in the small Prevy's liturgy. The phrase for their good becomes literal. The ledger records restraint as therapy. The bricked wall shortens a shame that is only social, not criminal. The culvert takes away soil bedding. The light clears a season of sick room air. The graves exist. The simple story sits down and will not rise again. Yet the simple story cannot account for the erased name in the family Bible. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. Why scrape a page if you mean to keep the children as memory? Why hide the ledger of what you wrote to be brought to the part of prove care? Why pay for a falsified if all you needed was warmth? Why does the sexton's memory and nameless corners at the burial ground fit too neatly with a gazette line that also spares names? A clean account should have like names. Something happened in the small Presbyterian of Pine Ridge. Instead, everything that would anchor the story in daylight is rubbed thin. A ledger found in Attleborough puts a kindermast over something hard. A weaver records 2 small shooters for 2 small persons who arrived under a different surname in late winter. He writes that the children came from Providence and that the woman who delivered them used a phrase kin by duty rather than blood. A Quaker minute from Smithfield. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge, badly water-stained. Notes that a family has taken a pair without certificate and that their names will be settled later. A genealogy compiled in 1840 claims that 2 cousins of uncertain after a loss and were treated as birthright thereafter. If any of this holds in the crate not carry bodies, it carried a doubling that the town could no longer keep under its own name. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge, but the bricked room becomes a chrysalis. The twins emerge into other names. The ledger's ash is a mask for protection rather than guilt. But then why the midnight coach? Why the culvert rather than the road? Why the payment for sous clothes or baked bread, but rather moves things that do not wish to be seen? Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement, and when it could have been untied forever if the children were to see the light of another hearth. Why the mother's head that says they're not bad, only bright? Bright is a word you use for someone staying in your house. It is not a word you write for someone who has already left it. Another story fills the cellar with commerce of a colder sort. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement, and public money that polished the Rutherfords. All sperma spread a light too sharp for burns with a clean bite. The twins are shown the factory as infants and they are never allowed to brightness again. The family learns the wrong lesson from a fit. The doctor's warning hardens into doctrine. They keep the house dim as a ship in fog. Something happened in the small Presbyterian assumption of chain and chairs belong to the era's misunderstanding of how to curb a nervous disorder. The bell breaks because a family broke under the weight of its own drug of choice. Light is both industry and poison. The irony satisfies the town when it needs a morality tale. Still the ledger defeats any neat moral. The handwriting learns to deceive itself. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement. It interrupts the word provided in the exact way that guilt interrupts an excuse. The crate persists as an image the town cannot file. The culvert keeps its polish in a small ark. A child's risk could make no other. Is a caution about light. It leaves us in darkness. Doer is a narrower and cruer telling that no one prints, but many know by the corner of a moth. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement not only to heal, as the other is kept within the chamber, not only to heal, but to be kept as one with the dead. The phrase written on the blank back page becomes policy. The bell becomes a line to the other side. The chairs face one another as if in court. The bread is broken into equal halves and laid like an offering to symmetry itself. When the living twins' lips fail to speak in mirror, something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement who's cut to end the desire for answers from a soundless bell that has a crate goat to avoid a grave by day that would need a name. A second small plot is claimed at the burial ground weeks later. Make the ledger match the world. The house then must scrub you till even it believes a gentler script. If you prefer a rumor with no bodies at all, the town can oblige. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. Some say the Rutherford father was already unmade by debt to a firm across the water, that the twins were sent quietly to a sponsor until accounts could be mended. Names erased because credit attach anything that belonged. Children counted as belongings if not in speech. The ledger hidden so a sheriff's hand could not turn it into a writ. The bell cut the mowers that made the mother falter. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. The brick plays a temporary measure that became permanent because the story thirsts for scandal but receives only a dull fact called, yet the debts recorded in surviving papers do not map to a crisis. The Rutherfords as figures sail smooth into the next decade. No notice of sheriff's sale, no public quarrel in the Gazette with a creditor eager to shame a gentleman into payment. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement. A tale satisfies only those who want sin without blood. It spares the town too much. The tanner is always the last refuge, the haunt that needs no to. The bell rings in fog. The chain whispers when no one moves. Pairs of marks show in dust even after floors are redone. Workmen speak of 2 taps behind them and nothing there. Something happened in the small Prejudice at Centuries settlement hiding house. Lodgers at Centuries turn refuse the room above. A later respectable owner loses sleep when a noon sound trickles into the dining room and is swallowed by wallpaper. A child visiting from Rehoboth writes 2 names onto a pane with breath and then cries because he cannot read what he himself has written. The house says its own story. When the town fought, it says it without nouns. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement. Taught not to trust the category of evidence. Still it accumulates like lint in a pocket. It will be there when you reach in for a coin, whether or not you believe in lint. Hearsay is wild and documents me, but both go lame in this case. The Gazette wants a fever, the doctor wants a cure, the minister wants patience, the neighbor wants an excuse. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. The mason wants a day's wage to buy silence as if silence were meat. The ledger wants to turn mercy into a verb that can be repeated. The Bible wants to keep its page whole. The town wants a grave with names. It gets 2 corners or none, depending on who drinks at the sex, and every telling for its out opposite, every proof throws its own shadow. Something happened in the small tree and settlement of Pine Ridge. The contradictions lie atop each other like warped boards that appear to fit until a weight is put on them. You will ask which is not my right to choose for you. I keep the fragments because fragments are all that survived, and because their edges cut, I place them on the table in no particular saint's order. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. I wait for a draft to turn a page and for the room to tell its version in the only language it can still spares. The color ash, the weight of a brick that is just a bit too smooth. The line written even when the hand had no strength left to write. Provided for the twins this night, maybe you hold your own theory already. Speak it softly here. Put in the comments like a folded note under a loose floorboard. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement. Read every theory. I carry them back into the narrow stair and lay them where the dust shows 2 small ovals as if hands had once waited there for a door to open. Stay with me. The legacy of this house is still to come, and the fog rolls up even when the tide says it should not. If you want me to keep prying open respectable brickwork and pulling out the pages that smell of lie and guilt. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. The scribe and stepped 1 step further into the dark. After the ledger shut itself, the town opened its curtains again. The river performed its old work. The Gazette filled its thin pages with ships and sermons and forgot the line that had trebled it. Neighbors, the house on the rise breathed as if nothing had been bricked in Sam to that for the willing. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. It lays a gloss over darkest grain and calls a shine piece. The Rutherfords died and married and left and returned like any family that keeps its own. The brick house learned new keys. A nephew took it for a while and tried to make the nursery cheerful with paint that did not hold. Leader, a widow, opened the door to paying boarders who wished for quiet above anything else. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement where a traveling teacher hung his coat where a chain once hung. A milliner laid out her pins where had lain. The hearth warmed strangers who did not know the wall had a mouth. False bookcase stood and did its work with stiff politeness. A layer of plaster hid a line where a door once sighed. The surface kept shining. Here the house did not entirely consent to repairs continued. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement. Oakman came to repair the east window set where one would do, placed in a way that made no sense to a carpenter. A plasterer hosting hawk set his tool down and swore that something tapped twice at the back of his hammer. A maid sweeping found a little prints in the lime dust where only one child had crossed the room. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement. The prints were forgone by afternoon as if the floor had drawn them into itself out of hunger. The bell chain when it was at last discovered. The people laughed at themselves for hearing it. No one laughed the next day at noon when it came again and then swallowed itself as if embarrassed. Fog climbed a hill from the river on evenings when weather loud and seemed to carry a thin ring within it. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine, faint of brightness without weight. In the boarding years, lodgers spoke that arrived faint but exact even when the meeting-house bell was silent. Some pressed their palms against their ears and waited until Sue could attach like burrs. A dressmaker who took to the back room in spring heard Contim inside the flute, and she turned 30. She spoke warm a pause. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pingan. Then a march to 7, then a start again as if the Countess did not seek a destination at all but only the comfort of beginning together. She moved her so into the light of the front room. Every hymn she finished that month seemed to end in a double knot. The sexton who sorted 2 nameless corners at the burial ground kept his tale even when winter carried member grain by grain. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. He would take drink and refuse to walk past those corner folk. He called them his little kings. He said he knew that but could not stop saying it. When the fence was mended and the stones shifted, he put a hand to his hat as he passed and lifted it a fraction as if a polite pair were seated nearby. The ground gave no answer that a sober man would admit. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. By the great the Lord learned a louder voice. Water came up into streets that behaved themselves in fair weather. It found the old mouth of the culvert without anyone's help. It forced a thin, angry sound through stone and brick and plaster. People said they heard a bell where no bell should be, a high, bright note buried in endless Russian. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. Men who had never wept in storms put their hands over their faces and refused to explain why. The water dropped back and left the house with a smell of salt where salt did not belong. The false bookcase water wall kept its secret, respectable print made room now and then for old house tales. Columns called reminiscences drifted across winter issues and then were bound up by a fond editor. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine. An old neighbor wrote that the Rutherfords of the hill always left a double blank in their family Bible after the year 62 and that no one ever asked why, because Providence prefers modesty to clarity. Another spoke of a widow who would not cross the street on the east side at noon because she did not wish to meet the thin sound that lived there. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. A printer added a flourish to these mentions to make them sit better on the page. The flourish did not change the soughing enough to be rowdy. Learned the story in whispers. Students went down to stand on the street at midnight and dared one another to knock twice on the door and listen for 2 taps in answer. They carved marks in the back of benches in the way foolish boys will. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement. They called the twins a soberer company than any professor could be. One night they pushed the false bookcase and felt it move a hair and ran. Next morning one of them turned pale over breakfast and wrote a line in his Latin textbook without meaning. 2 provided for the twins this night. He sent for a new book and burned the old one in the yard behind a boarding house. The ash clung to him. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Washed and could not get free. A deacon found a scrap from a ledger and a bundle of waste paper used to start a church stove. It had bubbled edges and a line he could not stop re-one. He put it in a hymn book and then forgot which book. He sang every verse that winter with a weight in his hands that no one knew. He wrote in his own diary that he had carried something he could not own. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. He died with the diary open on a page that lifted when the window moved. Another family bought the house and pretended to resurface improved. Plaster white into a brilliance that offended the older wood. Bannister didn't smile with less help. They kept their windows unlatched in summer and said there was no ghost. Then their daughter began to speak to a corner where no one stood. Something happened in the small Presbyterian treasure. She counted and left a space for someone else to count. When no one did, she grew in domestic fury the way a child must. She grew and forgot. She left town. She sent no letters home. Pairs remained. 2 swallows nested under the eaves each year, even when the carpenter went up with a long pole and discouraged them kindly. 2 knots persisted in a stripper that was otherwise smooth. Something happened in the small Presbyterian of Pine Ridge. At dinner 2 places were sometimes set by mistake and 2 rings appeared on a mantel where a maid put candlesticks only once and found a clean circle in dust that ringed another circle beside it. The house insisted on symmetry where life did not require it. It was the kind of insistence that does not need explanation. It simply stays. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. Here was Storer with a careful hand and too much curiosity pulled back a patch and found not chalk marks but a dull cold area of stones where breath went shallow. He wrote a note but he felt watched by a gaze that did not know how to blink. He put his tool down and knelt without expecting to kneel. He whispered to a house and told it that someone had seen enough. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. When he stood his knees were grey with dust and his hands smelled faintly of pitch and iron. He told no one. He returned after hours and cleaned the suit with a cloth that he washed twice and then the town gathered itself up and called its old streets a heritage. Benefit learned to hold it to her doors open to bodies of visitors that no one would ever take home to towers told stories that could pass inspection. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. The Rutherford house allowed to keep its name but not its blot. The brick chamber was not on any printed map. The paper celebrated gutter tape found its way to mantels and carpets. People felt better. The house kept the rest in the cool where the day does not settle. You can still feel if you stand correctly. Noon brings a light that does not quite enter the zerd even when shutters are open. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. If your midnight brings a bread as older than the last owner, if you let the sound of your own blood quiet, little you will hear something that could be a bell or could be your own teeth remembering cold. A sound that starts to ring and then thinks better of it, a sound that is both a question and its answer cut in half. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement Pine Ridge. Old neighbors who moved at quieter villages wrote back that Providence had a way of keeping a secret like a stone under the tongue. They wrote that the hill a hum to it that could be felt more than heard if you walked slowly at dusk. They wrote that children raised they learn to count before they learn to read and that they can't in echo. Some of these claim the embroidery that distance adds. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement that beesiteth, and with fogged tree it would be easy to let outhouse soaking into its own twilight. That would be gentler, but there is the page that was scraped, there is the line that refuses to finish itself, there is the back leaf that says they must be kept as one in a hand that is not the careful hand of the other entries. Something happened in the small Presbyterian. There is the odd generosity to a man who routinely carried crates and did not sign for them. There is the quiet conspiracy that good tonnage when they need to keep themselves upright and do not want to know what it costs. This is the legacy. The respectable surface improved, the darkness refined, its manor house learned to hold, but the way some people learn to the hidden one. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement in Pine Ridge. The Saldron became a way the town speaks to itself about what it is willing to erase for the sake of looking well. The sound of the bell at noon is a conscience that does not insist. Once and then once again in voice anyone can ignore. The ledger hid and then refuse to burn. You cannot burn a question just by feeding it fire. Sometimes a visitor ignored van steps wrong and feels the temperature change. Something in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge weird. Sometimes a baby in arms turns its face toward the small files at a corner where everyone else sees nothing. Sometimes a pair of moths circle a candle and keep opposite one another until they are tired and drop. Light travels. Darkness travels behind it and learns the same routes. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement of Pine Ridge. The story found its way out of the house into the town and then back again as if it too kept by a chain that remembered a small wrist. Perhaps a clerk will open the right box in the right attic and find a folded letter with names on a thin line waiting for air. Perhaps a chant in a vestry book will be read for what it is and not what it pretended to be. Something happened in the small Presbyterian settlement that the burial ground will shift and show 2 small stones where grass does good work it was not asked to do. Perhaps the only names left to speak are the ones you bring with you when you hear the bell that sounds only inside your chest and decide it calls you. Do you think they were sent away under another surname or laid quietly near the pits where swine once rooted? Something happened in the small Bacharian settlement of Pine Ridge. Do you think the chain was charity or punishment? Do you think a mother chose mercy and was wrong, or a father chose dignity and lost his? Do you think the town helped the house keep its shape or pretended it did not know how such shapes are made? You have walked the length of this with me. You have dust on your hands whether you can see it or not. Perhaps you will find the missing names. Happened in the small Bacharian settlement of Pine. Open the archives yourself if you want me to continue uncovering these buried histories. Subscribe now and share your theory in the comments.